Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture in Gender and Power. So for this week, you will have two student presentations. Again, week by week, it'll depend, but usually we will have one, maybe two, sometimes zero, sometimes three student presentations per week. I will be posting those by the time that you hear this. They will already be posted, in fact, up on Blackboard, or possibly the YouTube channel if it's a video. I don't know. I have to figure that out. So again, how this class works is Tuesdays asynchronous, Thursdays are synchronous. Some weeks I will add a mini lecture on Tuesday. Many weeks I won't. And some weeks you'll watch a film on Tuesday. So it'll kind of vary depending on how much time I've already taken up based on the student presentations and based on which readings I think would be especially helpful for you to get more insight on. I'm already realizing that I need to back out of this presentation. Will it let me do that? Yes, okay. So this is going to be a very brief presentation I'm sharing on Rogers today. And on Thursday, we can talk about this and talk about the Combahee River Collective Statement. And hopefully we have time to do a little activity that I've planned for Thursday. All right, so, okay. So Roger's article, there's a lot going on in here, and that's partly why I thought it might be helpful to do a mini lecture as well on Roger's piece. So here we finally get to ethnography, right? Here is some data that's based on ethnographic fieldwork. She does fieldwork in this peasant village. If you notice, this is a very early text in the anthropology of gender. So let me get to the points that I wanted to say here. Okay, so this article is coming out in the mid 70s, right? Around this time where we have an anthropology of women coming about, right? Rogers is doing field work then around this time in a rural peasant village in France. The village has a population of only around 350. And her work is centrally engaging with a concept of agency. I bet many of you who are anthro or soc majors already know what I'm talking about here. But for those of you who don't, or if you don't, you're anthro and soc major, don't worry. There will be a whole unit on agency as it relates to gender and power in this semester. So Rogers is writing about this peasant community at a time when anthropologists are also writing about peasant societies and power more generally through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's a movement within anthropology to look at or embrace Marxism or think about questions of power and class in the global scale, like especially for what was then called third world societies, right? In the ways in which they were oppressed by the global north. But Rogers' work is putting an emphasis on the relationship between peasant societies and gendered forms of power. So she's really also speaking to the subfield of political anthropology. And within peasant studies, women were often in anthropology read as what she describes as passive and long suffering victims, right? They're often painted as in various peasant societies across the world as kind of those who suffer under the heels of men. And Roger really wants to challenge this argument in this piece by showing that women are, peasant women specifically, are what she calls goal-seeking creatures. Right, and here's where we get to the question of agency, right? That women are actively engaging with their male counterparts and alongside other women, right, to see their goals come to fruition. It's also kind of an interesting article just because it's focused in France and ethnography based in Europe, whereas of course most anthropologists, especially at that time, 60s and 70s, were still working in areas outside of the West, right? So in this village, power and leadership are treated with suspicion, right? Generally, one doesn't want to be seen as one more powerful than one's neighbor. And this is, a cultural value in rural French peasant life, as Rogers describes it, right? The idea is that you don't want to seem like you're more powerful than your neighbor. In fact, you want to seem like you're no more powerful than your neighbor again. And also, and here's kind of Rogers' major argument, male power is different from female forms of power. They are mutually dependent and complementary. So in other words, in this society, the powers that men have in their realm are simply different from, because it's a different realm, from the power that women have. Right? And here she talks about these various kind of structural differences. There's a kind of structural binary that delineates male forms of power from female forms of power. So men in this village have formal kinds of power, whereas women have informal kinds of power. Men have de jure forms of power, whereas women have de facto forms of power. De jure here meaning as it pertains to law or legal forms of power, right? In other words, kinds of power that you would see in books, in legal texts. De facto meaning that is, it's just simply practice, how it's lived out. So, if it is that men have more power, legal power, than women do in the society, she shows how in practice, in everyday life, women have their own kinds of more subtle or domestic forms of power. And of course, I'm leaving it up to you to have read the article to give examples of what I'm talking about. So the importance here is, sorry, I'll keep going. So men have overt or obvious forms of power, women's forms of power are covert, and men's forms of power are natural versus women's forms of power are also based in the supernatural realm. So what's important here is this idea that they're complementary, right? It's not that women are more powerful than men or men are more powerful than women, but Rogers argues, no, they just are in different spheres or different kinds of power, and they're doing different things. Now, if you recall from Risoldo's article, and in fact, you might want to go back and read part of that article, she's responding to Rogers. So Rogers writes this. The piece we read by Risoldo said, yeah, I get it. There's different kinds of power according to Rogers, but nevertheless, men and women still live together and alongside one another in these villages, right? So kind of getting ahead of myself there, but I wanted to bring us back to Risoldo, and we can talk about this on Thursday. Another thing that Rogers describes that's interesting is that, we already talked about how women are associated with the private or domestic sphere, whereas men are associated with the public sphere. And Rogers argues that in peasant societies, that is kind of agricultural-based societies that are beneath some sort of upper class, right? These are all kind of working class folks in this village for the most part. Anyway, culturally, the domestic realm is valued more than the public realm. So if in a sense, we would think the public realm is where the power is, right? It's the level of the state, the mayor and laws, right? These sorts of things, politics. Rogers says, sure, but actually people in general value domestic life, and they think that the domestic space, the space of the home, the hearth, is culturally more important to people in the public realm. So because women dominate in the domestic realm, in a sense, there's a kind of reversal of power, given the fact that it is valued more than the public realm. And so men's, in this village, if you're a man in this village, in some ways, Rogers says, your prestige is based on the prestige of your family, of your sons and daughters, of who they wed, of how people understand as your household, your family, one that's well organized and kept up well, right? And that's the work of women. So in some ways, she says men's prestige depends on women. So she gives, and I already mentioned here, women as goal-seeking creatures earlier. Now she mentions several specific forms of evidence for women's power. Women control the family budget in these villages. Women raise children and influence decisions regarding their household. They often cajole their husbands into following their decisions. In other words, a woman might want the husband to do something, so she'll find a subtle way to kind of get him to do it without forcing him to do it. Another interesting point that you'll recall was about widows and widowers. Right. Maybe I'll leave this for Thursday to see if someone can bring that up on their own. And women also kind of push men in their lives, or their husbands or their daughters, to either for men to maybe think of shifting from the farm to the factory, or they push their daughters to marry a man who works in a factory, again, because they see that farm life is dying out at that particular time in that particular part of France, and that there was more money power in taking a factory job. So, the title of this piece that she writes, Female Forms of Power and the Myth of Male Dominance, is provocative, right? This idea that, wait, the myth of male dominance, I thought we already agreed that it's not a myth, that it's a cultural universal. Well, what Rogers is saying is it's a myth in the sense that it's not totally true. It's a bit more complicated than that. While men have access to authority positions within unions, within the government as mayors, in terms of the day-to-day affairs of the family, where important decisions are made, budgets, money is being spent in the sense of the family budget, right? This is the realm of women. Women recognize that their economic activity is no less important than that of the men, right? And that sometimes men's participation in political or social life is relatively trivial. So like women in this village that Rogers spoke to understand that they have power, right? But what's interesting is that community members do not openly acknowledge or consciously articulate male dominance as a kind of myth, right? So in other words, this is Rogers' Etic, remember that term? Her Etic interpretation of this village is that she looks back and says, actually, women have a lot of power in this village. It's a different kind of power, right? But these villagers, these men and women don't get together and or even in between the women, they don't come together and say, ha ha ha, we have all the power in town, right? It's all very subtle and not consciously articulated. So in conclusion, throughout this article, Rogers is basically pointing out the assumptions that are embedded in anthropological work in the study of politics and power, right? So instead of, for her, Rogers is essentially saying, it's too easy to simply say that men have more power than women. We need to look at, the fact there might be different kinds of power, and there might be informal forms of power that women wield against their male counterparts. All right, and that's a wrap.